Recently, I have taken to ordering and categorizing all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of unfinished video projects on this channel, wherein in most cases I've recorded playing samples, but then not gotten around to recording the commentary on those playing samples and what that instrument or mouthpiece actually represents. And this backlog extends as far back as June of 2022, back when I was baby-faced and did not have a lick of stubble to speak of. And that is how far back into the backlog I reached for today's subject, the Getzen 988 combination valve and slide trombone. Let's get started. Today I'm feeling like getting right down to business, so let's take a look at this beauty and talk about some of its features and specifications. The serial number on this trombone is a KN series, dating it back to the early-ish 1970s, early to mid, somewhere between 1972 and 1975. This is a beautiful silver-plated instrument. You'll notice some nickel silver in certain strategic spots, particularly around where the left hand grips the instrument, and this is really good. Although I don't know how I feel about the two contrasting shades of general silver color, one being more warm-based, like the actual silver, and one being very much cool-based, the nickel silver, I do think that even if the colors clash a little bit, this is a really good thing for the instrument, because when silver plating is applied to brass instruments, in most cases it's done at like a 0.5 of an inch thickness, and that silver wears away really easily if you're not careful, particularly if it's somewhere where you're gripping the instrument, you're often rubbing across it, you're sweating on it, whatever the case may be. That silver wears away very quickly, whereas nickel silver tends to stick around a little bit longer. Nickel's better for durability in this case, so that's a very nice feature of this trombone. This trombone, as I mentioned in the intro, also has both a valve section and a slide section that you can attach one at a time to the bell section. That is not always the case for the Model 988. I most commonly have seen it just with the valves, so it's cool that you get both in this case, and you can use either to your liking. Features of the valve section include a lyre holder, as well as top-sprung, pure nickel-plated pistons. Most valves in the industry are plated with Monel, which is a primarily nickel compound, but pure nickel is not something you see as often on valves, and Getzen is the foremost manufacturer that uses pure nickel plating on valves, and their valves are considered some of the most highly regarded in the entire industry. Also worthy of note, in keeping with 70s Getzens, is the fact that the water keys on this instrument are not the typical levers that you would see, but Amato water keys, which I have mixed feelings about. I think the maintenance of the Amato key is fine. You just oil it the same way you would your valves, because essentially it is a piston. You have a metal housing and a metal part that moves up and down. You have metal scraping against metal, therefore you need to put some lubricant in there once in a while, about as often as you oil your actual valves. But the trouble with Amatos is when you buy a used instrument with them and the previous owner was not too aware of that fact, and so you get an instrument with seized Amato keys. Or better yet, just really slow ones where you can push the Amato in and then it gets stuck in the open position. So, not a huge fan of Amatos generally speaking, but the ones on this instrument worked fine. They were well taken care of. Also worthy of note, looking at the bell section, first things first, we do not have a counterweight. This is obviously less necessary when you're playing a valve trombone and you're holding the valve block out here. You don't need that counterbalance, but the trouble is when you put on the slide, which is a relatively heavy one, again in keeping with Getzen, then you start having a little bit of front heaviness on the instrument, and that is less fun because then you need to tense up your right arm and bring it back up into place. Also on the bell, what is conspicuously absent is any sort of Eterna branding. When I first looked up the Model 988 valve trombone, what came to me were results for the Eterna valve trombone, which was the name for Getzen's top of the line at that point, and there is no Eterna brand name on this bell, whereas the actual brand name has existed since 1962, which is far before this instrument was made, so I'm not really sure what gives. We've also got a couple of different technical specifications to talk about here. The bore at the valve section of the valve half of the trombone is 0.486 inches, or a 486 bore. It sounds small, but it's actually fairly common if you look at old con director trombones. Actually, some of the upper level cons also had 485 bores at the slide, so for a valve trombone, 486 is nothing too unheard of. They tend to have quite small bores. And the hand slide bore of this instrument is 0.500 inches, or a 500 bore, and that is very much the standard standard. People tend to really gravitate towards kind of that 490 to 508 sort of range for jazz trombone bores, and so that is right where you would expect it to be. The bell on this instrument, however, is supposedly especially designed for valve trombone, according to Getzen, and it's got a 7 3/4 inch flare. It's yellow brass, soldered bell rim, pretty standard features all around. I don't see a ton of 7 3/4 bells. What I typically see is either 7.5 on really small tenor trombones or 8 on normal sized jazz tenors, so this falls right in the middle, but again, that flare was supposedly specifically optimized for valve trombone, whatever that might mean. Now, to sort of kickstart our playing discussion for today, I'm going to start by just rolling a few excerpts right back to back, valves and slides, so you can observe kind of the two sides of this coin that is the Eterna 988, and you can see how they compare, and then we'll jump into some of my impressions. As far as with the valve section, I noted a few things. Great valve action, of course, is no surprise. That's kind of par for the course with Getzen instruments. And a good amount of bark in the tone, as would be expected from a traditional valve trombone sound. But when you dial it back and play a little softer, you can actually get kind of a nice, almost low flugelhorn sort of sound. I think flugelhorn and valve trombone makes for a really nice combination in certain big band settings. And a common complaint with valve trombones is that they tend to be stuffy in most cases. I found the upper register pretty free on this instrument, and it wasn't too stuffy down low, but you do definitely start to feel it with multiple valves down, and I've played one or two valve trombones that I think maybe do a little bit better in this regard. With the slide section, my biggest gripe was definitely just the front heaviness of the instrument. Getzen slides are already oftentimes considered too heavy by some people in the trombone community, and let alone once you subtract a counterweight from the equation, then you're really in awkward territory. Even just watching back playing demos from 2.5 years ago at this point, I can tell, even as not a trombonist now, let alone back then, that my slide movement was really stilted and awkward because I was simultaneously moving the slide with this arm and propping it up as well. And that's what I alluded to earlier on in the video, where that induces a lot of tension into your slide arm, and you might not notice it consciously, but subconsciously you will struggle to play on a slide that is too heavy or an instrument that is too front heavy in general. With the slide section, you could also get a decent bark in the tone, but there was a lot of density as well in the sound, a lot of core for a small bore that I would consider slightly undersized. To me, the exact middle of the compass is the 500 bore and 8-inch bell. My frame of reference these days is a King 3B, which is a 508 and an 8-inch bell, and this is a 500 but a 7.5-inch bell. But this is a 500 bore and a 7.75-inch bell, so I would consider it, just by specs alone, a tiny bit undersized, but in terms of tone, I don't think it's undersized in any way. It's got a lot of really nice center to the sound. Something like this isn't quite as cool as, for instance, the premise of the Holton Superbone designed for Maynard Ferguson, wherein you actually have the ability to use both sets of pitch changers at the same time. You've got simultaneously a slide in the right hand and a full 3-valve section in the left hand. But that is a tough instrument to play. I've had the opportunity to play one at Clearwater Music, where I filmed this review as well, and it's just hard to get your bearings on. I'd like to think I have a good ear and I have a good handle on both of these sorts of things. I play French horn, so I'm used to this, and I play trombone, so I'm used to that. But putting the two together is hard work. It takes a concerted effort even just to remember to stick in like a simple scoop in a mostly valve passage, let alone trying to actually mix and match the two the way, let's say, James Morrison does.
Again?
So, with all that in mind, while a combination trombone with a separate valve section and slide section is a step down from the Superbone in that sense, I think it's a really useful tool for jazz without being too much trombone at any one given time, the way the Superbone felt the couple times that I tried to pick it up. The Eterna 988 also isn't the most common valve trombone out there. If you're just looking for something dependable and useful, I would consider something like a Yamaha YSL 354V. I've reviewed the slide counterpart of that trombone, which is the 354 without the V. You can find that up in the card. And there's also the Jupiter JTB 700V, of which I've also reviewed its slide counterpart, the straight 700. You can also find that up in the card. And you'll notice with both of those are two very standard student trombones, again, right in the middle of that compass where they've got that 500 bore and that 8-inch bell. And they've got easily acquirable slides if you get the valve trombone version. So if you want a valve trombone, get one of those valve trombones, and then maybe get a slide secondhand for $100, and then you have both of them the way you would have on this Getzen Eterna. That's of course sort of the base route, if you will, student model valve trombones. Nothing wrong with either of them, both very respectable instruments. If you really want to go pro and you can't find an Eterna on the market, what I think you should consider maybe even more highly than the Eterna in my opinion is something like a King 2B or 3B equivalent. For instance, Gonzaga University's music department, that's where I go to school, has a King Legend 2166 valve trombone, which is essentially a 3B bell section combined with a valve section. I got to play the school's 2166 for a fusion tune we did last spring in the jazz band, and oh my goodness, it is an amazing instrument. It might be the best valve trombone that money can buy. And so I would maybe consider a King valve trombone, or maybe even something like a Bach 16 valve section. There is the Bach 16 slide trombone, but then there is the V16 valve section. That also might be well worth considering. The Bach 16 is very highly respected. This Eterna 988 plays well, and Getzen's trombones are generally quite highly respected, but the way it plays and responds just isn't really my personal cup of tea, and I think their symphonic tenors and basses are generally more worthy of consideration and a little bit more highly reputed than are their small bores like this. And with that, that is one of so very many backlog entries done and dusted. I hope you enjoyed this discussion of the Getzen Eterna *988 valve and slide combination trombone. If you did, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below. The support on the channel lately has been amazing, and I'm so very appreciative to each and every one of you who subscribes and tunes into the videos. And until next time, we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.